Today we are speaking with Conor Madigan, the founder and CEO of Aether Fuels.
Instead of making those fuels by refining fossil oil, we are taking a variety of different sustainable waste streams. We dramatically reduce the net addition of CO2 into the environment.
They have found a key innovation in the production process that was commonly overlooked.
There are, fortunately, lots of sources of waste carbon out there. All of those waste streams have carbon that we can access and convert into fuels.
In this conversation, he breaks down that tech and the overall landscape of the sustainable fuels industry.
We believe will give us the lowest production cost and highest yield.
We also took time to ask him about his advice on hiring and team building, and it did not disappoint.
Until you've built a big network of your own, it's pretty invaluable to have a top-notch recruiter.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of CleanTechies, the best podcast for clean tech founders to learn from others. I'm Silas Maynor, clean tech headhunter at Earth Tech Talent, and today I will be your host. All right, today we are speaking with Conor Madigan, the founder and CEO of Aether Fuels. In the sustainable fuel production industry, they have found a key innovation in the production process that was commonly overlooked. This innovation combines two core parts of the production, leading to a much lower CAPEX to build projects, which in turn leads to projects that make more financial sense or projects that pencil out. In this conversation, he breaks down that tech and the overall landscape of the sustainable fuels industry. It's also worth noting that Conor is a second-time founder, and in the first company that he founded, they built large machines that produced OLED screens. It's a very large company that ended up raising hundreds of millions of dollars in capital and has sold over $1 billion worth of machinery. In 2020, he stepped away from that to go build Aether Fuels. Because of this second-time founder aspect, we also took time to ask him about his advice on hiring and team building, and it did not disappoint. He offers a lot of really interesting gems, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. Before the show starts, big shout out to Earth Tech Talent for sponsoring this episode. If you do need help hiring top talent, but don't want to pay absurdly high recruitment fees, reach out to Earth Tech Talent today. All right, enjoy the show. All right, Conor, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great, thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, super excited to have you. Where are you calling in from again?
From Chicago, where we're home based.
Nice. So I'm not too far north of you. Just up here in Wisconsin, enjoying the slightly colder weather.
Nice. Yeah, I had a very hot weekend.
Yeah, it is summer obviously, so it's fine. It's fine in Wisconsin now, but I just thankfully we're not going to be here this coming winter for much of it. So, but anyways, for anybody who's not familiar with you, kind of give us a quick intro on who you are and what you're working on today.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the Aether Fuels CEO and co-founder, and our company is developing what we believe to be the most cost-effective and flexible platform for producing sustainable fuels for some of the industries, the big industries that can't electrify, like aviation and ocean shipping. And we're aiming to bring them fuels that are cost-effective and enable them to decarbonize.
Amazing. And something we like to ask people at the beginning is also, who is a kind of a climate tech OG, or as we like to call them, a clean techie, that you would love to be able to have dinner or coffee with, somebody who's really kind of inspired you or been a change maker in this space?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not an original answer for this crowd, but I would definitely point to James Hansen as sort of one of the most interesting guys to talk to about really bringing the science of climate change to kind of the broader community, and making us really aware that this was a challenge that we needed to tackle urgently.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Actually, we haven't heard that name yet, so I appreciate that. Now let's spend a little bit of time kind of running through the technology, kind of a TLDR. So again, explain what you're making and who do you sell to, and we'll go from there.
So we make sustainable fuels that are drop-in compatible with existing fleets of planes and ships. So in short, what that means is we're making jet fuel and diesel fuel that's chemically identical to the fuels they use today. But the critical difference is that instead of making those fuels by refining fossil oil, we are taking a variety of different sustainable waste streams and converting those waste streams into these fuels, so that on a life cycle basis, we dramatically reduce or even eliminate the net addition of CO2 into the environment associated with using those fuels. And the innovations that allow us to bring something unique to the marketplace are based on some unique catalysts, process, and equipment technology that greatly reduces the cost of the production facility and increases the yield, the amount of product we can get per feedstock coming in. Uh, and to do this with a lot of flexibility to use different types of feedstocks. And altogether, those innovations have allowed us to really bring something that's a breakthrough for the market into reality.
So you probably can't explain all of it, otherwise you give away your secret sauce. But can you just, for somebody who's not, super familiar, can you help me visualize kind of the core blocks of what is usually done, and then which pieces you're able to remove or make more efficient that you're doing in your process?
Yeah, so there are a few different ways to make sustainable fuels. So let me briefly explain like what they do today, which is a
Mhm.
main type of a source of fuels, and then explain kind of what the industry is moving to, and that's really where we are able to bring some unique innovations to the table. So today, most of the sustainable fuels that we have are produced by converting waste fats and lipids like used cooking oil into jet fuel and diesel fuel. And that's what's called a hydrotreating process that people often use the acronym HEFA or HEFA to describe. And that is a great technology. It's why we have these sustainable fuels like sustainable aviation fuel or SAF today. But there's not a lot of used cooking oil in the world. And so even if we use all of it up, we're only going to be able to service a few percent of the world's
Mm.
demand for aviation and shipping fuels. So we need to be thinking about what's next. What are the abundant sources of waste carbon that we can use? And there are, fortunately, lots of sources of waste carbon out there, like CO2, biogas, agricultural waste, forestry waste, industrial off gases. All of those waste streams have carbon that we can access and convert into fuels. So that's where we're focused, that sort of next wave. Those have enough feedstock for us to completely solve this problem. But the challenge is that these waste streams are much harder to convert into jet fuel and diesel fuel. And so you need more equipment, which increases the cost of your plant. And you're also constrained to pretty small scale plants relative to oil production because you can't get the same volume of feedstock in one place the way you can with fossil oil. Fossil oil is really easy to put into a ship, move it around cost efficiently. So you can make really big plants. Like in the US, we use barrels per day as a scale. So like 100,000 plus barrels per day would be pretty commonplace for a refinery. If I want to aggregate wood waste or industrial off gases in one place, I'm typically talking 1 to maybe 5,000 barrels per day. So 20 or 100 times smaller. And so that's also bad for CAPEX efficiency because smaller plants just can't get as good economies of scale. And so we really got to tackle and focus on how do we bring CAPEX down. But at the same time, we don't want to sacrifice yield because in the sustainable fuels industry right now, these fuels are very valuable to all of the aviation and shipping companies that want to meet all of their regulatory obligations to keep reducing their emissions. And so how do we cut CAPEX but also maximize yield? And that's really the sort of fundamental problem. So one of the main ways that people have proposed to do this is a route called the Fischer-Tropsch route. And in the Fischer-Tropsch route, there's basically three main building blocks. There's a first block where you convert your input into syngas, that's CO and hydrogen. Generally, you'd call that the syngas generation block. Then there's the actual Fischer-Tropsch block, which converts CO and hydrogen into hydrocarbons. And those hydrocarbons are basically just carbon in a chain with hydrogens around. And that's a kind of mix of all kinds of different lengths of hydrocarbons. And the hydrocarbons are what are called normal paraffins. And so you need to do a little bit of further processing. You got to chop some of them up to make them the right length and do a process called isomerization that branches them. And that gets you to your finished product, your jet fuel, diesel fuel. So that third step is what's called upgrading. So where we come in to help drive innovation is that we had a recognition when we looked at the market when we were setting up the company in 2022 that the Fischer-Tropsch block had been the focus of a lot of really good innovation in the industry over the previous couple of decades. And there are now today multiple good companies building Fischer-Tropsch technology suitable for that scale of plant that I described, that sort of 1 to 5,000 barrel per day scale. But there hadn't been a lot of innovation on the syngas generation and upgrading steps.
Mm.
And so that is where we focused our innovation. And so what we found is with some new catalysts and some new equipment designs, we were able to drastically cut the equipment cost for those two sections by concentrating what was multiple steps into fewer steps. And the overall result of that is to cut the CAPEX of the plant by about 50%. And so that on its own is already a big step forward. The way we boost yield is that the first step in that process where you make syngas, that step requires heat input. And traditionally, that would have been done by burning fuel to make heat in what would be called a fired reactor. And we use electricity to drive the heat into the reaction, basically by running electricity through a heating element that just gets hot and transmits that heat into the reaction. And the advantage of that process is that we don't burn fuel and produce an emission. So all of our input stream and any of our recycled material all just stays in the process. None of it's diverted as a fuel. And so it means that we can maximize the amount of carbon that we get out in our finished product relative to what we put in. And if you compare an electrified system versus a fired system, you can boost the output by about 20%. And so that combination is very powerful for being able to drive down the cost of the product. On the back end, the innovation that allows us to improve things is driven by eliminating separations from the stream. And so that the process intensification, where I said earlier we reduce equipment, is realized by some special catalysts that allow us to basically take the raw output of the Fischer-Tropsch reactor without any separations or cleanup and run it straight through the upgrading reactor. And altogether, those innovations are really just about how do I make the plant as simple as possible so that I have fewer steps, fewer pieces of equipment, and as efficient as possible. And we integrate our innovations in that front and back end with the best of the commercial Fischer-Tropsch technology that's already out there. And that package is what we call Aether Aurora. That is our brand name for our unique solution, which, as I mentioned earlier, we believe will give us the lowest production costs and highest yield. And the last point, which I mentioned in the introduction that's very important, is that this approach is particularly flexible. So we can apply it to a CO2 and hydrogen plant, which some people refer to as e-fuel if the hydrogen comes from electrolysis. We have very efficient design for e-fuels, but we can just as easily take biogas, which is CO2 and methane, as an input to our plant. We can take the off gas from refineries or other industrial facilities that currently might be either flared or just burned to make heat. As those industries switch to more sustainable energy sources, they are still producing those wastes, which will eventually get stranded. And then we can go use those to make more sustainable fuel. And lastly, we can work with the gasified output of various types of waste streams like wood waste and agricultural waste. And so this sort of very flexible kind of Swiss Army knife solution in the middle that we have allows us to work with almost every type of waste stream, get deployed in almost any geography, and just bring down the cost of that production.
Got it. So a couple follow-ups. So number one is you're saying that the objective here is to actually build the very large output systems, right? You're not looking at that 1 to 5,000 barrels a day unit.
No, we are. So we're still doing 1 to 5,000 barrels per day, but we're solving the CAPEX challenge by greatly simplifying the plant design. And in many ways, what we're doing is we're optimizing it for that scale. And the Fischer-Tropsch companies that I mentioned They figured out over a number of years how to optimize for that scale, and we're now applying innovations that are optimizing the first and third steps, the syngas generation and upgrading steps for that scale, so that we can recover a high CAPEX efficiency, which was lost when we attempted to just use sort of conventional technology and designs and to kind of use them at these small scales.
Mhm. Now, does every facility have to be optimized for a certain type of input? Because you can take in many types of waste input, it sounds like, but would that be each plant is going to be optimized for a different type of input, or can you kind of mix a bunch of these things together?
You can definitely mix multiple streams at a given site. Usually, you would not be able to like perfectly optimize a plant to be dynamically changing the
Yeah.
feeds. And so it would be no problem, for example, to design a plant that could use part of its feed as, say, wood waste, and another part of its feed is biogas. You could design such a plant. But you would generally want to keep using those
Same
feeds.
stuff.
But you could certainly design in an ability to flex, say, maybe it's starts off at 60% wood waste and 40% of your input comes from biogas, but you designed it to be able to flex between like 30, 70, and flip back around to 70,
Mhm.
30, something like that.
Yeah.
So it does have that flexibility because the same catalysts and equipment are used for all of the different feeds. Um, but you would size the equipment a little
Mhm.
differently depending on which feeds you were using.
No, I think that's fascinating because that way you can just find the place that has abundant feedstock, right? So you can optimize for whatever that is, but I'm assuming, depending on what industrial production is going on nearby, you can just build it correctly, right? Build it to size, if you will.
This is actually one of the critical, I think, sort of learnings about dealing with waste is that uh, because it's sort of inherently not grown or manufactured as the primary output, you a lot of times just have what you have. And so that flexibility is really just sort of an essential feature. If you can only process one waste stream very narrowly, then it's just inherently going to be a drag on your scalability.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm very curious, how did you guys come up with this innovation? Because it sounds like, if I'm not mistaken, there's, a couple core blocks here, and for some reason, everybody was focused on one area of it, whereas you just looked at the process and said, okay, what about these other areas? Can those be optimized and innovated in? How did you go about that? Or did you guys take this out of some university? Like, how did this work?
Yeah, so the core technology was found after we had developed our business thesis. So the
Mhm.
company had kind of an interesting arc. So I'm a repeat founder, and in my first company, I came to believe that the number one most important thing in sort of building a startup is you have to establish a really compelling business problem with a deep and sort of fundamental customer need. And that's really what we focused on first when setting up the company. So that's how we focused in on aviation and ocean shipping and coming up with drop-in fuels, and we knew what we wanted to do. And then we looked around for the best technical solutions we could find. And that technology was ultimately came from a really amazing research institute here in the Chicago area by the name of GTI Energy. More than 80-year history, being an innovator in originally the natural gas industry, and then more recently as a great innovator in energy transition. And they had been developing a set of technology as part of a gas to liquids program that they started doing in 2016 with DOE funding. And we got to know them starting in late 2021, and then got into some more serious business discussions in 2022 once we saw that what they had we felt was a good fit for what we wanted and was at the right maturity level for a company to kind of spin it out and take it forward. And that idea of broad flexibility was something that we could see that technology could deliver. And the real sort of critical sort of thesis for us was that the industry had focused for a number of years almost exclusively on CO2 and hydrogen as the way to make these fuels. And we still believe CO2 and hydrogen long term is critically important. But what we felt was that the hydrogen prices at that time were being projected to come down very fast, and we just didn't believe that that would be true, which at the time was an unpopular view. There were a lot of folks who were absolutely
Not,
convinced and very invested in hydrogen
yeah,
prices coming down
not
quickly.
not so unpopular now.
Now, yeah, everybody agrees, and it's just sort of like that's a mainstream view. But at the time, it was contrarian, and so that really drove us to think about, okay, can we come up with a solution that is perfectly optimized for CO2 and hydrogen, but also works great with other feedstocks that are available now? And when we saw the technology at GTI, we saw something that was really interesting in bringing costs down, but also had this feature of being very well suited to these other feedstocks.
Nice. No, that's really cool. I just find it interesting how people can decide where to focus the innovation on because, in your case, you were able to find something that existed, but I'm assuming if you had not found some existing technology, you guys probably would have went to work trying to do R&D to identify those areas. Is that accurate?
Yes, but I will also say that when I set out to build this company, so I was coming in as sort of the business executive interested in doing something in climate, but without like a specific objective that, oh, it has to be this one particular thing. I was
Mm,
basically looking for the business that would be a good fit. And so I was looking at multiple different business problems, searching for technology at the same time. And I think in our case, we were really looking for the combination of a technology at the right stage matching up with a really compelling business problem. So if we hadn't found the technology, we might have picked one of the other routes to focus the business on. But in this case, we were able to find the thing that we were looking for. And so when I tell the story this way, it just sounds like it was this straight line where I said I was going to build a company in this space, and then I went and got the technology. But really, you're hearing the result of a funnel
yeah.
that this is where everything came together.
Yeah. Now we've had a couple other guests who did something kind of in a related fashion to this, and I do find it quite fascinating because it's often the case that there are technologies out there that solve some of these problems if you can figure out the business case properly at the beginning and then just kind of do the research to find the technology. And a lot of these people, they just develop technology. They don't even necessarily know how valuable it is because they're just, playing around in a lab, which is good. We need these people, right? So it just maybe some encouragement for other people out there who are commercially minded and think, hey, I'm not a scientist. How am I gonna, how am I gonna start a climate tech company? But you're proof of that right now. So, let's go back a little bit more on your background. So, can you talk about where you came from before this? What were you doing before, and then how did you have the conviction to specifically work in this space in climate?
Yeah, happy to. So my background is originally technical. So I have a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT, and I was mostly like a physics person in school. And my first company was the sort of traditional startup route where I had a technology that I worked on in my lab. I got to the end of my degree. I was interested in spinning out a company. And so my advisor and I sort of brainstormed like which we thought was going to be the most interesting technologies and then basically launched the business technology first. We had an idea of how it was going to be used. But honestly, we did not do much deep thinking about was this really a great business problem. In the end, it worked out as being a pretty interesting company to build. So what we were doing was making manufacturing equipment for the OLED display industry.
Mm,
And we launched the company in 2008, which was before OLEDs were really a commercial thing. And so we had sort of a conviction that they would be the display technology of the future. And we had identified what we felt was going to be a really challenging manufacturing step that needed this sort of new innovation, new process, new equipment. So over the 12 years I was at that company, we successfully took this technology from basically a chemistry fume hood experiment where we were in effect trying to do inkjet printing as a technique for doing precision deposition of coatings, which was something companies have been trying to do for like decades, but not successfully doing. But we felt we had like some unique ideas on how to do it. And then over 7 years, we were able to get that technology matured into a machine that we got accepted in Samsung's manufacturing lines. And we were in the very first display a production that Samsung did of these OLED displays on plastic substrates, which is basically what almost all of them are now. And Since then, the technology has been sort of widely adopted as the main technology for one of the critical manufacturing steps. And I had a chance to, over that period of time, raise a few $100 million in venture capital funding. So I got to see all the different stages of fundraising. We sold more than $1 billion of machines over that period of time, and many of them are in the leading OLED production fabs all around the world. And in 2020, I had an opportunity to hand off the reins to the current executive team and step away so that I could basically do it again. But this time I wanted to do it again in an area where the work itself had more measurable, beneficial impact on society. OLED displays are great. I think they've made people's viewing experiences better all over the world, and batteries last longer because of them, and the devices are lighter, so all that's great. But I really felt like I could use my experience and do something a little bit more meaningful. And climate was sort of at the top of my list. And I like doing big pieces of hardware. I had a chance to do that in my last
Yeah.
company, and there aren't a lot of people that like to do that or have experience doing it. And so I sort of thought to myself, climate has a lot of big infrastructure challenges. You need to do big, complicated pieces of hardware. I want to find a problem that fits that sort of mold so I could use what I've learned um, and then assemble a team. Because I did feel like one of the things I got good at my last company was attracting the right talent and putting them together in teams that could be really effective. And so I didn't worry too much about not being a technical domain expert. I figured I could learn what I needed to learn to be a passable expert, and then that I would have a good eye for assembling the right team. And the last piece of ingredient or last ingredient for making Aether Fuels successful was having the fortune of connecting up with a really fantastic investor to incubate the company with. I ultimately launched the company with a fund called Zora Innovation, which is part of Temasek, the large Singapore investment platform. It's Singapore-based investment platform. It's about $300 billion under management. And the chief investment officer there, Phil Inagaki, he and I really bonded and got really excited about the idea of launching a company in the sustainable fuel space. And working together with the Temasek family has been really powerful. They're very well connected, very patient, have a lot of capital, and that's been very helpful for building the company.
Yeah, their model has been very interesting, and I think they do have a big focus on the kind of sustainable fuels industry, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but what I do want to know is, I don't know if you shared the dates exactly, but from when you left your last company, you said 2020, I think, right? To
Yep.
when you kind of landed on the specific idea that you were going to work on. How long did that take you? What was that time?
Yeah, so also to put it in context, so I didn't realize that I was going to be doing this in the middle of COVID. So it ended up being in some ways a fine time to be
Yeah.
sort of doing a lot of sort of reflection and thinking and brainstorming. But it was ultimately about a year, give or take, to um, think of different ideas and sort of beat them around, talk to friends and colleagues, and come up with a really strong short list. And it ended up being about 3 or 4 sort of finalist ideas that I did more intense study in for about 6 to 9 months to get to this one. And we really knew that this was going to be the one towards the end of 2021. And so we focused all the energy there. Um, uh, I would say, like I put aside all the other climate ideas, and this was the one climate idea I focused on for about 4 or 5 months to finally get to the point where we would launch the company. Um, And during that time, I did also look at other industries. So I was also interested in healthcare and in AI, but climate was always one of the thrusts. And so I'm happy that this is the one that worked out because it's been really satisfying to be in this space.
Hmm.
One of the really fun things is you meet a lot of other folks who are um, very talented, but also feel strongly about doing something that like matters to society, and it's kind of inspiring for me to be around that kind of passion.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. How did you so I think you said your last company is what, 13 years you worked on it? 13,
Yes.
12. Okay. So you worked on something for 13 years, great commitment to something long term. And then you go through this phase of really exploring and kicking ideas around. How do you turn off of that and then like go back to, hey, I got to stay focused on this for the long term? Because I think a founder's dilemma, obviously this isn't your first go round, but a founder's dilemma tends to be like they just chase shiny objects and they want to kind of look at the new things. So how do you switch so efficiently, it appears, from being focused to exploring and then being back focused again?
Yeah, I mean, I think what helps me is that my natural instinct is to be an implementer more than the sort of brainstormer. So I can do the brainstorming task, but really what I want to do is I want a big problem to just go work on and solve. And so for me, it was almost that the harder part was the part where I was brainstorming the ideas and looking at all the cool, shiny new objects, because I kept being a little bit impatient that I was like, okay, let's pick one. And so we can go build it. So for me, actually, it was that was actually the easy transition.
I see.
But what was helpful for me was bouncing my ideas off of colleagues and friends who I sort of learned to trust over the years, so that they helped me make sure the idea that I picked was a really good one in the end.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know that we've had a lot of people who had that natural tendency. Usually it's the other way around. It's a little more challenging to stay focused. At least that's personally how it is for me, right? There's always too many things to chase. You know, you talked earlier about how you had very high confidence you could surround yourself with a good team. Hey guys, Silas here. Welcome to the Talent Tidbit part of the show, sponsored by Earth Tech Talent. Connor is about to drop a bunch of gems when it comes to hiring and team building wisdom. If you're a founder in the hiring process, please get out your notepad because this is top tier advice that only comes with years of experience hiring and running teams. All right, let's get into it. So, I want to talk a little bit about team building. So, how can you walk us through how once you found the technology, how did you go about building that team? Kind of go step by step for all the core people who you brought in. Where'd you find them? How'd you go about that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I had a couple of sort of philosophical views that I'd formed on my previous company. So the first is that my kind of basic formula for what kind of profile of leadership team I wanted is of course on the one hand I want very high talent people, people who are exceptional in their space, but that are also low ego. And for me that sort of if you can find that combination, then you can assemble a team with sort of not worrying so much about how are these people going to work together. The bigger the egos, the more you have to watch out for like, do these particular sets of egos fit together? And so I found, that by really emphasizing that characteristic from the early on, I've had good success. The second is that I do have a general philosophy of trying to create um, constructive sort of tension inside of an organization by pairing together sort of certain personality traits. And so I generally try to bring in people on an R&D side who tend to be more fundamentally optimistic. So their like sort of baseline answer is yes, and only if they're totally convinced they can't do something, then they say no. And then on the engineering side, where it's sort of the people who now need to take the R&D ideas and build a big machine, that for those folks, I try to make them sort of fundamentally a bit more pessimistic, where their sort of default answer is no, unless they're absolutely sure they could go build it. And then sort of keep open-mindedness on both sides, but put those sorts of characteristics together. And so with that in mind, we did set out to go hire really strong head of R&D, really strong head of engineering, and we were able to get those characteristics and put them together. Now, in terms of actually finding the people, I just used a really good recruiter. So I over the years have gotten to know a few different recruiters who just really run an exceptionally good process. And the folks that I use for kind of senior hires, they've just done a really good job. They're very good at walking through a smart process to define the roles. And they have some specialty in materials and climate, and so they know all the companies and have a good network. I would say at the very beginning, until you've built a big network of your own, or if you're not coming over from the same space and you have kind of a built-in team, it's pretty invaluable to have a top-notch recruiter.
Hmm. So this is really fascinating. I think a lot of founders could benefit to hear from that. Obviously, I'm a little biased because I am a recruiter, but I am curious. Did you when you talked about these kind of building a team where there's two different sides of the coin, effectively? Was it that you had to find the people who understood that, or did you have to kind of communicate once you come in, this is how we're doing it, and we want to have completely opposed kind of natural tendencies, but we need you to have open minds together. How did you go about that process, or was it just natural to those folks that you found?
Yeah, I mean, it was part of actually the job description is that like on the with the recruiting team and in my own interviews and with folks, I would tell them like, we're looking for somebody who has this sort of mindset that this is their natural tendency. And so when we put these folks together, I would say that the uh, the tension is sort of there by kind of natural instinct. And the open-mindedness is also part of the search process. So you try to see what kind of projects they've worked on in the past, and sort of probe people on how comfortable they are with sort of structure and uncertainty. And you kind of try to put them, in a spectrum. Since you come from recruiting, you know that you can only learn so much in a bunch of sort of 40-minute, sessions. And so it's an imperfect process. And so you can put together people with instincts, but there's still management to do. You've
Hmm.
still got to
Yeah.
make sure people understand their roles. You understand why their role is the way it is. You sort of teach people to kind of have permission to be the way that they sort of want to be, but also know what their roles are. So all that's still important, but we did it mostly by trying to recruit the right people. When the company's small, there's only so much you can do with just process. The company just culture really mirrors the way that the leadership team sort of behaves and interacts.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, this framework, this is one framework I think that is very helpful. I really appreciate you sharing that. Are there any other frameworks for different teams where you say, hey, we actually we don't follow the same thing, where it's we want two opposites, we want something else? Are there any other structures that you've learned, because you've obviously built a successful company before and you're working at it again?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are versions, to some extent, versions of the same thing in other parts of the organization. Like you, by design, want your finance team to be more pessimistic. You want your like BD team to be like the more kind of optimistic, innovative personality. And I would say the only other thing I would say that's just universal is that I have become a big believer that at least at the leadership level, sort of clear thinking and clear sort of reasoning, it sort of is not something you can sort of uh, compromise on. And so even if you can bring in somebody very, very charismatic, but if you sort of drill down to their sort of internal thought processes, if they're not like crisp and clear, that at least for a small company, you have to make decisions so often, and the decisions need to be sort of well reasoned and thought out without a lot of supporting process and iterations and sort of consensus building, or it becomes too slow.
Hmm.
So you need everybody to be really, really good at that sort of clear, rational, kind of data-driven thinking, or you start to get kind of a chaotic organization. And so that sort of applies to everybody. So whether they're more pessimistic, more optimistic, more innovative, more structured, like all of them were definitely probing, like asking them, trying to ask them questions about how they made decisions in the past, and sort of biasing towards the folks who seem to be very sort of organized and thoughtful about, okay, I made this decision for this reason, and I sort of naturally want to gather data and um, uh, make decisions where I wasn't sort of unconsciously, just going with where my gut took me, but really thoughtfully choosing a direction. I guess the other thing I'll say is just that the last caution for team building is that you have to be careful when you bring in senior folks at the early stage of a company to make sure that they are still folks who know how to be a player coach, because small organizations at the beginning generally can't afford to have pure managers that like aren't prepared to do some of the work themselves. And that is a particular challenge when you're recruiting from big companies. And so, successful folks may have been the player in the early stages of their career, but in a bigger company, there's just more infrastructure and you
Yeah.
get away from needing to really do too much directly yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that you have to be aware of the extra risk you might be taking when you try to transport somebody like that back into an organization where they're like, you're going to do your own calendar and you're going to have to make your own presentations.
Yeah.
And um, uh, some people can do that transition. Some people really struggle with that shift. And so that's definitely something to be mindful of.
Yeah, I just really appreciate it. I think the underlying thing to me of what's really good here is that you have very clear expectations at the beginning, which is something not a lot of first-time founders tend to have because they haven't been through the ringer, so they can kind of try to at least visualize what they might run into through listening to your advice here and do the same for themselves. What one maybe one more thing I'd like to ask is, in the early days, especially if there is a lot of change, how do you manage ensuring that everybody has been communicated to the different changes? Because I've seen a lot of times where founders, they're very clear about what's going on in their head, but they forget that they have to, communicate it to everybody else.
Yeah, we do a system where this is not, groundbreaking, but we at the early stages of the company, which we're still doing now, even with 25, 30 people, um, every week there is a weekly meeting that's the entire company for an hour, and we run through all the different divisions, like doing their rapid fire updates. But like part of my job at the end of every one of those is to let people know what's the big picture, like what has changed or not changed in the big picture. Um, why is this or that work stream like right now the most high priority one, and why? I should say, what work stream is the high priority one now and why? Um, for that specific reason. Um, and I have heard founders be like, oh, but you don't necessarily want your team to know everything that's going on. Like maybe they can't process it or so. And what I'll say about that is you absolutely need to be thoughtful about how you're communicating what's going on. So you can't just, like share with no context. But it's usually worse if things are starting to go off track and you're not saying anything about it, because these organizations at these sizes typically kind of naturally know something is off, but you're just not saying anything about it, and it's creating even more sort of distress and uncertainty. So staying on top of, like, if you are starting to feel like, oh, this is not on track anymore, then your team probably knows this, at least unconsciously. And
Mm.
so kind of forcing yourself to make sure that you're thinking about, okay, like what is the known problem, and like getting in front of telling people like either I have this solution, this is how we're tackling it, or we know this is a problem, the leadership team is on coming up with a solution, so that people don't think it's just sort of a, that the leadership team is unaware.
Mm. I mean, this is super valuable. You sound like somebody who's got a lot of scars because nobody seems to know these things, right? If things are going badly, they just try to focus on, high energy and just ignoring the problems as if their team won't notice, right? And their team always notices. And as a recruiter, when their team notices because they all start giving you calls.
Yeah, well, and for sometimes, like, there's a you can get used to the idea in as a CEO that like who has the right ideas for a certain problem, and you're like, oh, I don't need to tell everybody about this because I know that it's these three people who can help solve this problem, and that is usually true, that you are right on who's going to solve the problem, but it's often enough that somebody in your team has a bright idea that is not the person you thought would have the interesting idea, that there's also just value on its own in terms of the problem solving to be willing to share kind of what are the challenges and invite people to weigh in. And you have to be mentally prepared to answer questions and tackle them, even when sometimes the suggestions might not make sense, but you still have to be constructive. But yeah, it's like, it's not just about getting your team comfortable, but you really honestly don't know where the good idea might come from. If you hired a bunch of really smart people, then they all can contribute.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, actually. All right, I hope you guys found that valuable. To recap, have a very clear vision of the role that you're hiring for, and also the dynamic of the team that you want to create and to have. Create constructive tension in how you construct your teams. As he mentioned, you want optimistic and pessimistic people, but with an open mind to each other. So that way you have this kind of push and pull or stop and go within the team that creates a really, really healthy environment. Another one is find people with high talent but low ego. Another one, as an executive team, ensure that you embody the principles you want others to follow because especially when the team is small, the culture is basically emulating whatever you are. So you are the default culture as the founder or as the executives. Another one, when hiring senior people, make sure they are able to be a player coach. Often when you're hiring from big organizations, this is much harder to find. So be very, very intentional about it. Another one, ensure all executive hires have clear reasoning and the ability to communicate that to the team. It needs to be clear what they're thinking and why they're thinking it. And then finally, he said, especially in the early days of your company, utilize a search firm that has built out network in that particular space that you're working in, and that can that this company can also run a thorough recruitment process. Is very important because you need to be able to view all of the people in the process and really kind of understand how they compare to others, and then meet all of these criteria. Can they be player coaches? Are they optimistic or pessimistic? Do they have the open mindset? Do they have low ego? All of these things come into play when you're trying to run a thorough recruitment process. And if you are in that phase of building your team, reach out to me and my team at EarthTech Talent. Our specialty is placing tough to find US based talent at CleanTech startups. And the best part is we charge about half of what other search firms do. To get in touch, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to earthtechtalent.com/contact. That's ERTH techtalent.com/contact. All right, enjoy the rest of the show. So let's talk about the policy trends and just kind of the market in general. Where do you see the SAF industry going right now? Like, what are the core things driving interest in the space? Is it still going really strong? Because I think that, if we're in the US and there's a lot of mixed feelings about the climate tech and clean tech market here, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot of different mentality in Europe. So do you have any kind of core things that you think are driving the conversation and the demand on both sides?
Yeah, I would say so. So for sure, before, or I should say, last year, it was true that the biggest projected growth in sustainable fuels was expected to be kind of global, outside the U.S. In fact, like in Europe, the U.K. That is still true now. I would say that some of the policies that are sort of in place right now are likely to focus the sort of U.S. energy transition on more on carbon capture sequestration as the sort of core technology pathway. There's going to be less adoption in the U.S. for a period of time on the utilization routes, which is sort of more where we fit in. But biofuels are still strong. And so there was good support continued in the US policy for biofuels. And broadly speaking, though, that there are just more and more mandates being implemented all around the world. Europe and Asia are particularly strong in this area. And so that's really what's driving demand. And I think one thing that sort of, as folks sort of digest the impacts of the recent legislation in the US, I think it is important to remember that the U.S. still is a technology powerhouse in energy transition. There's still a tremendous amount of innovation happening here. And there are areas, pockets, where the policy is still quite supportive. And we do expect the policies to kind of be, in general, up and down. And so we have a global approach. So our business is not particularly impacted by the policies in any one particular country. And I would say the one area that did get definitely kind of the most challenge is green hydrogen. So there were some supports for green hydrogen that have been are going to be sunset earlier, and so that actually just reinforces our strategy, like we mentioned at the beginning, that by having a technology that's flexible to use different types of feedstocks, we can make sure that we're limiting our risk exposures to the policies that might impact any particular one of them, like in that case, a CO2 and green hydrogen route.
Interesting. So generally speaking, policy is driving a lot of the demand. Are you guys? I didn't ask you about this at the business model section, but is your product? Do you foresee it getting to cost parity or cheaper than current aviation fuels, or just fuels?
So yeah, just a quick note on our business model. So at this stage, we are a technology developer and a project developer. So we are aiming to bring our technology to full commercial maturity and build the first plants with that technology. So we will be a fuel producer. Down the road, we do anticipate then also adding a licensing business. But that said, we are very focused on that question that you just asked around, so what's the price of the product that we would, or cost of our production process. And let me first talk about price of the product. So today, the main incumbent product is the HEFA, the basically used cooking oil that's been turned into jet fuel and diesel fuel. And our expectation is that our first projects, we will be able to make the product at or below price parity with the current HEFA-based sustainable fuels. And so then the question is, what happens long term? So we optimize our technology more, we build more plants, we get more scale. How low can the price get? So this depends on the feedstock route. So if we're using industrial off gases, this is probably the most cost-effective route in our portfolio. There is absolutely the potential to get those to be at cost parity with fossil fuels. But in truth, we don't believe that that actually recognizes the full value of the product, because the value of the product is it's providing the fossil energy, but also the value of the CO2 abatement. And at the moment, nobody knows exactly what that's going to be worth long term, but because we can get the product price down to a pretty low level, we believe that in that marketplace, we can be consistently the lowest cost producer. And so that makes sure that our plants will always be ones that are making money. Now, I would
Sorry, just to
expect,
clarify, when you
yeah,
say in that marketplace, you're talking about in the fuel marketplace broadly, or in the clean fuel marketplace, because they want the abatement. Because if
yeah,
you're getting, they're getting the credits for having cleaner fuel, that
yeah.
plus
That's so
the
so
cost
so.
will be cheaper.
Our first focus has been on the sustainable fuels market,
Yep.
and I actually breezed by this, but just to give some sense of scale. So the aviation and ocean shipping fuel market in 2050 is expected to be about $1 trillion.
Hmm.
And even if you only believe 10% adoption of sustainable fuels, still $100 billion a year market. So our goal is to enable complete decarbonization of those industries. But from the standpoint of building the business market opportunity, there's just a huge market opportunity focusing entirely on whatever portion of the market is mandated. But we have these routes that we are focused on, such as the industrial off gases that can get to fossil parity. And so I don't want to say it's not possible to get there, but that's not the first target for us. The first target for us is to build the most cost-effective, most profitable plants that service this very large mandated marketplace.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to ask you is, if we were to get to the point where, again, it's even cheaper than fossil fuels to produce these fuels cleanly, what do you think needs to happen to get to that point? Is it just scale, or is there going to be more innovation required?
Yeah, so we transform some feedstocks into the fuels. So no matter how good our process is, we are still subject to cost of electricity as one of our inputs and the cost of the feedstocks as our inputs. So as the grid gets cleaner, if we can get global grids that look like, say, the grid in Brazil, where it's 90 plus percent renewables, and you can get industrial power contracts at 30 to 40 cents, 30 to $40 per megawatt hour. That is a really good place to be, and those kinds of prices can enable us to get to those really low production prices. And then on the feedstock side, I think the critical variable is bringing the cost of hydrogen down. So we have a lot of routes that don't use hydrogen, but eventually we're going to want to be able to use hydrogen as one of the inputs to really get to big, big scale, unlock, for instance, CO2 and hydrogen routes. And the right now, hydrogen cost is like in a good plant might be $5 per kilogram for clean hydrogen. And so if we can get down to much lower costs, like below $2, some people believe that if we have geologic hydrogen one day, maybe it's $1. Those are the kind of prices where you can start talking about cost parity, or being so close that the cost impact for the consumer is sort of negligible.
Yeah, no, that's quite. If it does get to that point, then why not go for the clean version, right? I'm sure there's a lot of other things we could talk about. We're out of time now, unfortunately. You've got so much wisdom you've shared today. I really appreciate you doing this. But is there any final call to action that you'd offer people, or where people should reach out? Any partners you guys are looking for, etc.
Yeah, I mean, we are, I would say, keep an eye out for some announcements in the September, October timeframe. That's kind of the big next piece of news. Check out our webpage, aetherfuels.com, or look up our LinkedIn, where we are posting about what we're doing, but also trying to repost the interesting work that some of our peers are doing.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a pleasure. Looking forward to having you again on in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it on social media. Drop us 5 stars on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you're feeling extra generous, give us a subscribe on YouTube. We also love any feedback. So if you have any comments about the episode, how it's structured, other guests that you'd like to see in the future, just reach out to Soma or myself directly on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time on Clean Techies.